From Software are the most unique developers of the modern day, and as such, it causes more people to want to try out their games. This runs into the problem of figuring out which game is best to start with. Do you start at the very beginning, or do you start with a more modern combat? There are many elements into making this decision: difficulty, accessibility, simplicity, personal taste, pricing, etc. This video will be about finding the perfect game for you, the newcomers, to start with. I'll be trying my best not to delve into spoilers, but I'll make sure to give a warning if I end up mentioning one. Also, this video will have visual spoilers, with the likes of boss battles and areas. With all that being said, what is the best Fromsoft game to start with? Part 1. Gameplay. Starting off with arguably the most important factor, let's talk about your preferences to gameplay. There are three types of people who play these games: those who like a slow-paced combat style, those who like a fast-paced fight, and those who enjoy both. If you are the kind of player who likes a more methodical style to your combat, the older games are where it's at. Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Dark Souls 2 aren't slow to the point of boredom, but they're slow enough to make sure your actions are thought out and timed well. This is perfect for new players who are unfamiliar with the style of FromSoft combat. Out of these three games, I wholeheartedly recommend you begin with Dark Souls 1, more specifically Dark Souls Remastered. There are drawbacks, such as only being able to roll in 4 directions when locking onto an enemy, but it's simple enough to understand, and you don't get into faster fights until, well, think about it, not until the DLC. That's not to say the other fights won't be a challenge, but they test you in a different way. The first half of the game is all about training you to become a competent player through the obstacles it throws at you, and practically rewiring your brain to look at the problems in a different light. If you're considering a faster paced game to start with, the two that stick out to me are Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring. Bloodborne is also fast paced, but lacks unlimited healing for the players, and so it might be too hard for newcomers. Same goes for Sekiro, but that's an entirely different style, so I won't be recommending that game for anyone to start with. Back to DS3 and Elden Ring, both have relatively crisp movement, and dodging is more straightforward, ironically. It's hard for me to pick one over the other, because DS3 is a lot more linear, and so a lot more friendly to new players, but Elden Ring, on the other hand, has a lot more easy fights and an open world, allowing the player to learn at their own pace. Looking at this from an objective point of view, I think solely for new players, that Dark Souls 3 would be the better introduction from a gameplay aspect. Elden Ring could arguably be too good for new players, that going back to the older games might be very jarring. DS3 doesn't have this problem, as it feels more like the older games but sped up. Part 2. Story and world building. Let's say you're in it for the story. You're captivated by the way the lore is written, as it requires you to interact with the world, rather than just watching a cutscene. If this is what you're looking for in these games, then the big three that come to mind are Dark Souls 1, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring. All of these games tell a standalone story that is littered across the entire world you play in. This is where we get into minor spoiler territory, so here's a quick warning for that. Dark Souls 1 tells the story of a dying world and the end of an era. You can see how NPCs are reacting to this, the roles certain bosses play in the end, and the state each area of the world is in thanks to the continuation of this current age. The theme of Dark Souls 1 is about staying strong and determined in the face of a bleak, indifferent world. Bloodborne tells the story of bloodlust and humanity. You see what becomes of the people that give in to their darker side, the cost of discovery, and the tragedy of the world you explore. You could argue that Bloodborne's theme is the inverse of Dark Souls, that of our own futility to changing the fate of the world. Elden Ring tells the story of ambition and bringing stability to a world that's breaking apart. As you explore the world, you see new characters either standing in the way to maintain the current order of things, or stepping up to make a change to it. In a way, Elden Ring is a spin of the theme of Dark Souls, attempting to change the world that others want to stay the same. It's really down to you which you'd prefer to experience first. Bear in mind, Dark Souls has 2 sequels, and so the size of that story is about as large as Elden Ring's, though Dark Souls 2 is arguably so detached that you could just ignore it. If it was me, I'd go for Dark Souls first, because its limitations in the gameplay meant that they were able to put more attention on the story to explain why these legends you hear about no longer hold up. Part 3. Availability. Now for the big one. A lot of us gamers are poor and unable to constantly pay for new things. For that reason, knowing what we should and shouldn't buy is vital. Demon's Souls is probably the least available of the lot. It released on the PS3 and remade for the PS5, but never made accessible to the PS4 or any of the Microsoft platforms. This would be a game I only recommend playing if you have the money for it. Dark Souls is arguably the most accessible, available on the Xbox 360, Xbox One, PS3, PS4, and PC, as well as being backwards compatible for the Series X and PS5. You can get this game quite easily, not to mention it has multiple editions. The one I recommend the most is the Dark Souls trilogy. This gives you all 3 Dark Souls games and all of its DLC for a decent price. In 2021, I got it for just £15 on Amazon, and as of the time of recording, it's available for roughly £30 after all the prices went up. For 3 games and 6 DLCs, that's not bad at all. And remember, these are Fromsoft DLCs, so you'll be getting your money's worth and then some. Bloodborne is the second least available, only being accessible on the PS4 and backwards compatible for the PS5. That being said, the price for Bloodborne is pretty cheap if you get a good discount on it. And there are a lot more people owning a PS4 than there are those owning a PS3. Also, if you get it with the Old Hunters DLC, it would be more than worth your money. Elden Ring is the most recent game, currently without DLC, but with the most content out of any of the games. The only thing that matches it is the Dark Souls trilogy. Available on the PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, and PC, a lot of people can buy this game. Would it be better to wait until the DLC is out? I'm not entirely sure. You get a lot from the base game, and you can always get the DLC later if you have the cash to spare. Out of these games, the Dark Souls trilogy is definitely the one I recommend the most. You get so much from it, and by the time you've done with them, you've saved up the money you've lost to get another game. If you have a PS4 or PS5, then I'd suggest getting Bloodborne. If not, I'd go for Elden Ring. After everything we just discussed, let's talk about what order I would personally recommend to newcomers. The way I'm determining this order is based on the idea that new players are looking to have the most amount of enjoyment from each and every game. I will also be talking specifically about which version of each game to buy. That way we can tackle as much as possible. Games 1, 2 and 3, the Dark Souls trilogy. 3 discs, 3 games, 6 DLCs. Available for Xbox One and PS4, thus making it backwards compatible for Series X and PS5. And can be purchased for not much higher than £30 on Amazon. By starting with a slower paced game like Dark Souls 1 and working your way through the whole trilogy and the DLCs, the jankiness of the older games will be a lot less noticeable than starting with something like Elden Ring. You also get a pretty in-depth story from the entire trilogy, especially the first Dark Souls. You'll be getting a lot of the best bosses in the series from these games alone, and the fact that they use the same names for all of their staple mechanics, such as Estus Flask, Souls and Bonfire, makes it easier to transition from one game to another. Game 4, Bloodborne, Game of the Year Edition. Some might say play this before Dark Souls 3, but I honestly think playing it after will be better, owing to it being a harder, slightly faster game with new mechanics to learn. After investing so much time into the Dark Souls trilogy, it would be better to end that story before beginning this brand new one. And trust me, this game is worth investing all your time into for the story alone. This game is probably the most merciless one so far, taking away your shields and your OP magic builds, and telling you to get your hands dirty for a change. Buying the Game of the Year edition will also provide you with one of the best DLCs the gaming industry has ever seen. Linking itself with the base game so well, you struggle to understand how Bloodborne could possibly be played without it. Out of the 4 games so far, Bloodborne is seemingly the smallest in terms of boss count, but that's rectified with the inclusion of the Chalice dungeons. Not the most necessary addition, but definitely an option for those who want a little more Bloodborne. Honourable game? Sekiro Game of the Year Edition. I didn't want to officially include Sekiro on this list, because there are those who argue it's not a Souls game. That being said, I wanted to put it here for anyone who was interested in getting the game. I think getting it later would make it a lot harder to adjust to, as is my current experience with the game. I've heard people started with Sekiro, and that's how they started playing the other Souls games, but it's honestly up to you when to play this game. I just think straight after Bloodborne would be the perfect time, as you'd be used to adjusting your style to a different game. Game of the Year Edition allows for some bonus content, but no proper DLC. Game 5, Demon's Souls Remake. Finding a PS3 and the original version of Demon's Souls sounds like a nightmare in the modern day. And getting a PS5 is expensive, which is why I placed the first game as the second to last. I think playing the Dark Souls trilogy first is a good gateway to seeing if you like the Souls games, and Bloodborne and Sekiro can be a good time killer to slowly save up for a PS5 if you don't already have one. One thing I hear about the remake most is that the gameplay is pretty much the same as the original, but the graphics are a massive step up. For that reason, I think it's a good idea to play this after the others. From a gameplay perspective, you're able to see how far From Software have come, showcasing Demon's Souls as an artifact of the genre. And from a graphic perspective, it's easier to forgive the shortcomings of the gameplay with such beautiful imagery. In a sense, the graphics are improving game after game, and there's something special about coming full circle to Demon's Souls before going to the big one. Game 6, Elden Ring. Once again, if you see this after the DLC, then get that version of the game. Just like Demon's Souls is going full circle through From Software's evolution, Elden Ring is your entire experience going full circle, starting with a trilogy of fantasy games, and ending with a fantasy game that's roughly the same size as that trilogy. From interconnected level design to a fully fledged open world. From games that were rather restrictive with movement and what you could use to fight with, to a game that allows you to approach any and every situation however you want. Elden Ring is the product of everything that From Software had learned in the previous 13 years. Not to mention, this game was gifted with the contribution of George R.R. Martin. You can play this first if you want, but playing it last will give you the most satisfaction across the entire series. And that's my recommendation on which is the best From Software game to start with. Again, it's up to you and your taste as to which you want to start with, but hopefully this will help those who are struggling to make a decision. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, or at least found it helpful. Also, please comment on which order you've played these games in. It's fun to hear other people's journeys through these games. Until next time, my friends.